And I have the pleasure of welcoming you today. I believe it is commonplace today to say that the European Union has been tested in unprecedented ways in the past 2 years. We've witnessed COVID-19. We now have a war in Ukraine that has brought a military threat to Europe's doorstep and make us realize how vulnerable we were, especially in the field of energy. And in the face of those crises, there is also collective acknowledgement, I think, here that the EU has reacted in very unprecedented ways in a speed that we had never witnessed before. And perhaps the most compelling example was last week when the European Council agreed to grant the candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova, and you were there. You participated in this council. So the very first question I have today to you, Roberta Metsola, is, what does this decision mean for Europe? And is it primarily just a symbol to Ukraine in a context of war? Or is it really a decision that will have consequences, since we know the enlargement process is a very tedious and long one?
Well, first of all, Maya, thank you. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for this question. Walking into the European Council last week, and when I was asked by journalists, what does this mean to you? My answer was, this is a historic day for Europe. And I continued by saying, I didn't think this would be possible even 4 or 5 weeks ago. And who would have ever thought that you enter a European Council, you get there with a unanimous understanding around the table across all institutions, Parliament, Council, Commission, that this was the right thing to do. And I participated in all those discussions, member states, countries coming from different places, both economically, dependence on Russia, long-standing debates on whether we should be more interdependent from an energy perspective, etc. But also member states and their leaders that have lived through what they thought was their worst crisis ever, only to face an even more difficult one geopolitically. So the message that we sent and that was made or taken also reflects a union that can act together with political strength, with leadership, with understanding that a decision like this has consequences, understanding also that the next few months are going to be very difficult and very challenging, but there was no other way that we could have done it. We have, and I'm part of a generation that has never witnessed war. So we are living in a war on our continent. How do we respond to that? Do we continue to look away? Do we continue to think that we can depend on cheaper energy alternative sources, etc., when we should have addressed that a decade ago? Do we realize that we need to be more interdependent in order for us to be stronger against a menacing country that likes to blackmail, or not? And these are, I think, this is the first question that we need to ask ourselves before we answer of what comes next. What will be the difficulties? What is that tedious period that you called? And you are right in calling it tedious. My country spent 10 years waiting to join the European Union. It was a very difficult period of time. But at the same time, it was part of a decision that the European Union took to expand, not only geographically, but also democratically. Today, I would add, from a security point of view, that expansion should be brought to the table. And I think that is what's driving, or what has driven the first step, and what will drive the next steps, which are also conducive to making sure that Ukraine and Moldova come closer. Also, you will hear, I think, from the president of Georgia later, that there are levels of integration, and that pre-accession period is extremely important and transformative for every state, and that would include Ukraine.
But so then what is the benefit for Ukraine? Like, why? What does it mean for this country?
When I traveled to Kiev on the 1st of April and I spoke to President Zelensky, and he said 97% of my population wants to join the European Union. In 2015, in Maidan, what did you see? You saw European Union flags. My people need to get the signal that the European Union wants them, that they can find a home in Europe. Are you able to deliver that or not? And I said, I'm going to do my best. I said, there will be a moment where you will get the big questionnaire, the step that you will need to discuss and answer on your preparedness, how much of your laws are aligned, how much programs, etc. And one of the people around the table said, we will answer in 4 days. And we smiled at that time. But in fact, they answered in 3 weeks, what other countries took almost 1 year to do. The European Union, in turn, has answered with lightning speed in putting forward the resources it needed to address the recommendations that we need to have. So I think that if we start with that significance, in order for also what President Zelensky asked me, to keep the spirit of people fighting a war, so significantly different to all accession processes. All enlargement processes are difficult. Every country has its own path. We don't package countries together. But there is that hope and spirit that could be kept alive. There is the financial assistance that should continue to be sent. Logistical, humanitarian, I was looking at with let's say, cautious optimism, people going back to Kiev, for the ones who had originally left, but we saw the attacks over the past couple of days that could also destabilize and increase mobility again. But also when we talk about the pre-accession period where you have access to programs, to research, to the possibility for students to have access, for us to use new rebuilding and reconstruction programs from a structural cohesion point of view. All this becomes available during the pre-accession process. And if we can already, because the speed with which the Ukrainians also and the Moldovans have shown us in terms of responding to what the European Union wants from them, then I think we can, the least thing we can do is respond with the same effectiveness and speed.
But we have exceptional circumstances here. This is also why the EU granted the candidate status to Ukraine, because there's a war right now. If we play the devil's advocate, enlargement is a complicated issue in the EU, and we know that the more countries we have, in a way, the more confusion there is, and let's say the processes are slow because it's a union with 27 states. So if we play the devil's advocate, do we really need expansion?
As coming from a country that heard that argument for a decade, confusion was used, not yet, wait a bit, legally and technically you're ready, but politically wait. I cannot be the one to say that we are full up or that the number of countries that could join our union has reached its limit. Who am I to say that? I represent an institution of 704 colleagues, besides myself, whose populations are overwhelmingly telling them it's time for the European Union to welcome other populations. Let's discuss. Let's make it possible. Let's not close the door. That's what we did last week. We also had a Western Balkan summit that I would have liked to have a better outcome for, because that is the similar situation. You meet leaders of these countries that have been told for decades, if you reach this milestone, okay, then we can go to the next step. Whole elections are lost and won. Whole governments are created or brought down on the basis of that sliver of hope that the European Union can give. And what is the European Union? We grew up, I'm a lawyer, I specialize in EU law. You know, you study whole chapters, this is about economic interdependence and the internal market and removal of borders. But we seem to have forgotten that it's also about fundamental values that we all share. That you can have a union without war. That the reason why we are together is because we don't want to go back to the darkest periods our community, our continent has seen. And if we look at that, beyond just the economic aspects, beyond just this no more, or I'm very comfortable, thank you very much, you know, you can fight the fight for us, and say that it's also about our own security, because you said specific circumstances. I mean, you are right in saying that after all, this war has an impact on all the countries. If you think about the rising prices, the dependence that we had, when you ask citizens, they would not even know that the essential staples in our food chain, for example, comes from Ukraine. Countries didn't know that we depend on Ukraine a lot. Countries in Africa depend a lot on imports of fertilizer, for example. So if we realize that we're talking also from a geopolitical and security point of view, then this is the time to have the conversation as to what this club of countries that comes together are. So I am more on the side of let's not close the door on people who wish to have Europe as their home. Because if we do that, they will look elsewhere. And let's not underestimate, this is also what we were told by our Western Balkan countries last week, the malign interferences of countries that want nothing more than to have the European Union telling them, not yet, or just wait a little bit more.
But then shall we reform maybe the EU and the EU the way it enlarges? Because this is also in question these days. Does the EU need to reform itself before even accepting more members? And you, as President of the European Parliament, a lot of MEPs have, voted recently to change the treaties. So it's an issue right now, an important issue in the EU. So
I think the word reform should never be off the table. I think we need to adapt. At the beginning of the pandemic, the instinct of governments was to close borders, as though we thought this virus is not going to stop at a police checkpoint. What did we realize a few weeks later? That we needed each other, we needed medical equipment to reach everyone, and later that we needed vaccines to reach everyone, irrespective of how poor or rich you were, or how big or small your country was. That was not even provided for before. Again, lawyers would tell you, no, there's no competence. The European Union has no competence over that. Health is something that is at the member state level and should be kept there. I come from the school of thought of what can be done at the local level should be done there, but what can be done also at the European level should be done there too. And if we look at how we adapted, reformed, if you want to use that word, throughout the pandemic, also in agreeing on an unprecedented package, economic package that can go to member states to recover and become more resilient. The word resilience has taken on so many shapes now. But that when you see the digital and green transition, when you see the fact that we have adopted ambitious climate laws because we need to reform, we need to invest more in renewables, can we not also discuss the energy union now? I think that needs reform. How do we do that? The Parliament has voted overwhelmingly for there to be that conversation. And I am never afraid to have conversations as to how we could be doing things better, as to where there are gaps, can they be filled? Or is it better not to do anything so that those gaps could grow? So I also went to the European Council last week and said the European Parliament is ready to have that conversation. The last time we had that conversation was 20 years ago. Many of us are still scarred from that procedure, that process. It was painful. But why should we not have that conversation today? When we've been looking away, as I said in the beginning, for over 10 years at it being easier to get cheap gas. We have energy islands with oversupply that can go nowhere because they're not interconnected. And this is going to start, it has already started, but it's going to increase, to pinch. It's going to hurt. So should we not have that conversation today as to whether there is need for further integration in certain areas? Why wouldn't we?
So how did leaders react when you said we have to have this conversation?
I will tell you how I answered in the press conference half an hour later, because there was a question about what kind of majority is needed. And this is in the European Council, you need a simple majority. But I also said something my advisors were not happy with, but it's okay on the record, so I say it again. Anyway, is that nothing is simple with a simple majority. So it is my role, but I was present. I joined the stage on the 9th of May with the President of the European Commission and the President of France, and promised to follow up on an extremely intensive debate that citizens had. I am an institution that is elected by citizens. What kind of parliament would it be that tells the citizens actually thank you, goodbye? We had a conference that was started by my predecessor, the late President Sassoli, together with then the Prime Minister of Portugal and the President of the Commission. We were given a mandate, and our mandate is to see what to do with the recommendations that we have from the citizens. And they range a lot from changing majority voting, what kind of things we should be dealing with. I would not say that that should be the end game. I'd say let's discuss, let's start the conversation. A duty to do that. And we have a responsibility as leaders to respond and keep our word. So I'm working on that to get the simple majority.
A very simple majority.
Really simple. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the transatlantic relations. We are here at the German Marshall Fund, and on Ukraine, there have been some differences of approaches, sometimes some different responses to the war in Ukraine, with the UK, between the UK, the United States, the European Union. I mean, how do you see this transatlantic relation evolving in the future, given that we can't live without the US, but there's a way, the European Union is creating its own autonomy, and how do you see this relationship evolving?
I have always been a transatlanticist. I have looked at the need, and this is an ever-increasing need, of securing stronger relations between the European Union and the United States. I'll add Canada also. If you see the outcome of the discussions at the G7 yesterday and today, that was never more clear. And even more importantly, when we are talking about the strategic autonomy, as you referred to, but also the discussion about having a serious security and defense policy of the EU. Doesn't compete with NATO, can complement it. It's important. Some countries are members, some countries are not. But at a time when the rise of autocracy is a real concern, then democracies have to work together. And this is, I think, something we woke up to when we saw, perhaps a sensitive point, but what happened in Afghanistan last year. A tragedy has unfolded now. This is something the European Parliament is very vocal on, and what's happening with women and girls there. But when you also see the unity with which and the speed, I mean, you mentioned the differences between Ukraine. There are always differences, but at the end of the day, there is an understanding that the war has to end, and that you cannot have a country in today's world that simply decides to invade another and not stopped. If we learned one thing, is that Putin did not stop in 2008, he did not stop in 2015. What were we doing all this time? He will not stop now. So the closeness with which we need to have political alignment with the United States, but this also leads in energy sources, supply chains, that we will become more interdependent. And I cannot see anything else but that. And I very much push for the conversation not only to take place, let's say, from a foreign affairs perspective or from a silo perspective. I think sometimes we have made that mistake, that we look at the relationship from our own individual angle rather from a global one. And this is the time for us to do that.
I see our timing is quite strict and tight. You have a lot of things to do. So maybe we can switch to questions from the audience, if there are any. Let's start with you. I think there is a microphone. Oh, wait.
Salome Mgeladze from Georgia. Foremost, I would like to express my gratitude for the support from the European Union and for your personal statements in supporting Georgia to put it in the European family where it belongs to. It was to mention that Georgia is champion among the associated trio in terms of legislative harmonization. Nevertheless, the existing challenges have reflected in the European Parliament resolution and in the recommendations of the European Commission. European Council and European Commission have set 6 months period in order to end shadow ruling and for de-oligarchization. My question is, how do you envisage this process in the given time frame? Is it realistic or more risk rather than motivation? And what will be the role of European Union to support Georgia in this process? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for this question. I can tell you that there are a lot of members of parliament from Georgia, a lot of representatives of all democratic forces that have spent a lot of time in the European Parliament in order to convince. And this is also something that I think is unprecedented, right? That we have this so-called parliamentary diplomacy that has brought members of parliament across all the countries to say, look, this is what we want and we are united in trying to get it. My question would be, rather than look at what is not possible, but let's do everything we can to do what is possible. The European Parliament statements are clear. I don't, let's say, I will have to see whether any more statements will be, because I cannot tell yet what the debate will be next week in Strasbourg, but definitely in September. I would say keep the pressure up in order to make sure that we keep our end of the bargain or of the negotiations and not let anything fall by the wayside. I think with conviction and with aspiration, also what we have seen in the past few days in your country is something that we can address. Of course, concerns are there. Questions will continue to be asked. We just want the answers to be forthcoming.
Maybe,
Simeon Somokos from the Delphi Economic Forum. Thank you very much for your comments, Madam President, especially about the enlargement in Southeast Europe. My question is related with Turkey, whether you feel that there is a future for Turkey in the European Union. And please don't get me wrong, I strongly favor the possibility, because the situation between our countries would be much better if Turkey was part of the European Union. Thank you.
I will start by saying that the relationship with Turkey is important. And it's important not only because of its geographic and strategic location, because of long-standing negotiations that we have had post-2015 on the migration flow situation, investment in the country, talking about the possibility for openness towards its citizens, and now also in the current scenario, questioning whether the resistance to Finland and Sweden's NATO accession, or in the possibility of being geographically positioned for the food supply routes is something that is being looked at very closely. I would, on the other hand, however, insist that as a European Parliament we are very much insistent on democracy and democratic participation and respect for minorities. I would also say that if you are an aspiring country to join the European Union, then you need to implement all sanctions packages in full. And not use exemptions at the risk of targeting other countries. I would also add by saying that a European Union that is divided in any specific country, and I refer to Cyprus here, is unacceptable and continues to be. And these are all negotiations and discussions we have to have with Turkey. Last point. When we talk about what has happened also at the beginning, just before the the COVID pandemic, the using of the most vulnerable people on the planet to put migration pressure on the border, on a land border of a member state is also something to be looked at.
I'll turn to this side. Also, perfect, thank you. Because otherwise I don't see you here. I don't know if I can take so many questions because we have a very tight schedule.
I'll be quick.
Yes, go ahead.
Denis Gursky from Ukraine. I'm former Prime Minister's advisor. So I think that Ukrainian perspective is very important. Thank you so much for giving this green light. I think it's all about perspective and threat every time that a big change is happening. So for Ukrainians, I think it is very clear perspective. But for European Union, it also brings some threats. It's a very unpopular subject to speak about potentially because there are security threats that this potential integration might lead to. How do you debate on these potential threats for the European Union if a country at war is getting this perspective? And how did you come over debating and persuaded the majority? Thank you.
It was not simple, that majority. It was clear, and unanimity. Thanks for this. Of course, we need to speak in the current context and what could be, right? So in the current context, we need to focus on ending the war. We need to help Ukraine win. And that means that we need to be quicker in our supply of military assistance, logistical assistance. We have not been fast enough. On the other hand, Putin thought he could take over Kiev in 5 days, and he didn't. So the spirit and the bravery that your countrymen have shown is something that this continent will never forget. I think we should already also start to talk about the immediate steps of reconstruction. We have to start looking at that and making sure that all programs that could be made available in terms of a deeper integration, trade, digital, economic, have to start very quickly. In terms of, let's say, territorial sovereignty, because or integrity, that's where we come back. We need to make sure that Ukraine can control its territory, and that's what we are helping it do. It is not easy. We discuss also this with Moldova. We discuss this also with Georgia. And that is a question that we need to continue to do to help. What I don't want is that for that fatigue to set in, that you know that there's a war going on, but then here we are dealing with the real and present economic that has ripple effects everywhere, but that we forget where we came from, and it becomes easy to do so. So I would focus on that in the immediate weeks that are ahead of us. But because we took this decision last week, which in the end was, and I also credit the leaders, I have spoken to so many of them, who literally, no, I wouldn't say changed their mind, but made up their mind when they visited Ukraine. And that is something that has also shifted the mindset of leaders of other countries, but whose public has said, listen, what are we going to do with Ukraine? And that would not have happened if they didn't do that. It would have been, traditionally, how the European Council is. I come from that, I joined the parliament from that institution, is that you sort of have 20, at the time 25 or even less prime ministers or presidents who enter that room, come out, 25 different statements, 3 sentences, and then you go. In this case, I have seen a dramatic shift in the way decisions are taken, because you have prime ministers say, listen, I have a national parliament that has told me that I need to go further than this language. I had never seen that before. And that is, first of all, thanks to the ground movement that has been taking place by Ukrainians across the continent, with the way that at the same time we have a classic war being fought, but a narrative and a counter-narrative being fought online. And that has also, I think, pushed the narrative in favor of Ukraine, and in a way I've never seen it. And that's really true solidarity and being European and the very core. And that has to be the be-all and end-all of all we do.